In the quiet streets of Palmetto Dunes, a black SUV pulls up, and three men step out in fake uniforms holding clipboards and badges they claim to be HOA police sent to arrest Daniel Reed for violations. But what they don't know is that Daniel is an undercover FBI agent. This is not a simple neighborhood dispute. What happens next will shock the entire community. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you love stories where justice flips the script, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story has an even bigger twist. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I had moved into Palmetto Dunes 6 months earlier. Most of the neighbors thought I was a regular guy who kept to himself. They saw me jogging with headphones on or working in the garage fixing up an old motorcycle. I paid my dues to the Homeowners Association like everyone else, but I did not attend their endless meetings about mailbox paint or lawn length. What nobody knew was that my move here was not random. I worked for the FBI in cybercrimes, and this community happened to sit right in the middle of an investigation. Several residents had strange ties to a fraud ring we were tracking. My job was to blend in, observe quietly, and gather information. The last thing I wanted was attention. That changed the moment Sylvia Hargrove decided to turn the HOA into her personal kingdom. Sylvia was in her late 50s with a permanent scowl and the confidence of a small-time tyrant. She loved rules more than life itself, and she loved power. Even more, most people ignored her endless notices about fence height or garbage cans left out too long. But Sylvia had grown tired of being ignored. She wanted enforcement power, and so she invented her own. She created something she proudly called the HOA police. In reality, it was 3 men with cheap black uniforms, plastic badges, and a lot of misplaced authority. One had been a mall security guard, another was her unemployed nephew, and the third was a retiree who just wanted free beer. She convinced herself they looked official. To an untrained eye, they might have. To me, they looked like trouble waiting to happen. It started small. I received a bright orange citation on my mailbox for leaving my porch light on overnight. Next week, it was a $50 fine for a motorcycle in the driveway. Then it escalated. They claimed I had failed to register as a resident pet owner, even though I had no pets. The warnings came with signatures from the so-called HOA police. I ignored them at first because I had bigger things on my plate. My undercover work had me tracing digital money trails late into the night. But when those 3 men stepped out of their SUV with mock badges glinting in the sun and told me I was under arrest for violation of HOA rules, I knew this had gone too far. I stood on my porch, calm on the outside. Inside, I was calculating. They had crossed from annoying to criminal. Impersonating law enforcement was not just an HOA quirk. It was a federal offense. Sylvia had taken her obsession with power and turned it into something dangerous. Neighbors peeked through blinds as the fake cops postured on my lawn. One of them barked that I was resisting compliance. Another began reading something off a crumpled paper that sounded like a parody of Miranda rights. It might have been funny if it were not so serious. I played along, nodding slowly, hands visible, making mental notes of every detail. Their uniforms, the fake patches, the SUV license plate. I wanted them to think they were in control, because the longer they acted, the more evidence I gathered. I let them finish their little performance. Then I asked if I could see the official warrant signed by a judge. They frowned, shuffled papers, and one muttered that HOA law was above local law. That told me everything. They were not just trying to scare residents. They believed their fantasy authority was real. Sylvia had built herself a private militia to enforce her personal rules. It was laughable, but also dangerous. People had been bullied into paying fake fines. Janet from down the street had told me tearfully that these men threatened to tow her car if she did not hand over cash. Mike, the retired postal worker, whispered that he saw them trying door handles at night. The line had been crossed long before they came to my door. Now it was my turn to push back. I told them calmly to wait while I got my wallet inside. They smirked, thinking they had one. I stepped inside, closed the door, and dialed a secure number. Backup was minutes away, but I knew this had to be handled carefully. If I pulled my badge too early, the case could collapse. The FBI was already circling this neighborhood for fraud. This stunt connected the dots perfectly. I adjusted the hidden camera in my living room window so it caught the entire scene. When I stepped back outside, my heart was steady. The game had just begun. The 3 fake officers shifted on my lawn, looking impatient as I returned to the porch. They expected me to come out nervous with an ID in my hand, ready to comply. Instead, I leaned against the railing, sipping calmly from my coffee mug. Their cheap badges caught the sunlight, but they did not carry the weight of real authority. One of them, a heavy-set man with mirrored sunglasses, puffed his chest out and demanded again that I surrender for HOA violations. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence like a teenager pretending to be tough. Behind him, the SUV door still hung open, and I could see the inside littered with fast food wrappers and a cooler. Nothing about this screamed professional, yet I kept my face blank, because letting them believe their act was working was the best way to pull more information. Sylvia watched from across the street, arms crossed on her porch, like a general directing her troops. She had that smug look, as if finally someone was taking her endless rulemaking seriously. Her neighbors stood quietly behind curtains and blinds. I knew half of them had been victims already of her self-styled HOA police. Janet, the single mother, had told me they issued her a citation for letting her son ride a bicycle too close to the sidewalk. Mike, the retired postal worker, laughed that they fined him for whistling too loud while checking his mail. Ridiculous rules, but with 3 uniformed men knocking at your door, many gave in and paid. Intimidation was their real weapon, not the meaningless tickets they wrote. Today, though, they had chosen the wrong target. I asked the sunglasses man what exactly the charge was. He cleared his throat and read from his clipboard about property endangerment and unauthorized driveway use. The words were jumbled nonsense strung together to sound official. I nodded slowly, memorizing every phrase. He insisted the fine had doubled due to non-compliance, and that failure to pay meant immediate arrest by HOA police. The absurdity would have been comical if not for the fear it instilled in others. I pictured Janet's face when she showed me her citation, trembling. That fear was exactly what Sylvia thrived on. She believed fear gave her control. I intended to show her what real law looked like. The second man, younger, with patchy stubble, shifted nervously. His fake badge looked like something printed at a copy shop. He muttered that they should get me in the SUV before neighbors filmed. That was the moment I caught Mike standing a few houses down, holding his phone, chest high, pretending to water his plants. Good old Mike, always watching. He caught my eye for a split second and winked. That footage might prove useful later. I kept playing the game. I told the men I was willing to comply but needed to secure my property first. They allowed me 5 minutes, which was more than enough. Inside, I placed a call to my handler at the bureau. Backup agents would set up around the neighborhood, but they wanted me to keep the charade going. The bigger the show, the better the case. When I stepped back out, I carried a plain folder stuffed with blank papers. I handed it to the stubble-faced one and said it contained my identification and payment plan. He opened it, expecting cash. His disappointment was visible as he flipped through empty sheets. I shrugged and said maybe they had the wrong resident. Sunglasses man turned red and barked that non-cooperation would be reported. Reported to who? I asked calmly. The silence that followed was heavy. They knew the answer but could not say it. Their authority ended the moment anyone questioned it directly. That was their weak point. Sylvia stomped her foot from across the street and yelled that I was a menace to the community. Her voice carried down the block, shrill and desperate. For the first time, other neighbors cracked their curtains wider. People were curious, and curiosity was breaking her grip. The third man, the retiree, looked the least convinced. His badge was crooked, and his hands trembled slightly. He looked like he regretted being involved. I filed that away too. Weak links often became informants when pressure mounted. I leaned forward and asked him kindly how long he had been serving on the HOA police. His mouth opened, then closed. He muttered less than a year and stared at the ground. That was all I needed. He was not a true believer, just a pawn. Pressure him later and he would flip. Sylvia shouted again, demanding they haul me off. I pretended to sigh and asked if she could provide the HOA charter authorizing arrests. She froze at the question, but quickly recovered, yelling that federal law did not apply inside Palmetto Dunes. My jaw tightened, but my expression stayed calm. That line would hang her in court. The men regrouped by the SUV, whispering fiercely. I stood motionless, letting them stew. Across the street, more neighbors stepped onto porches, pretending to check mail or sweep steps. The stage was building. The fake cops realized the crowd was against them. They either had to back down or double down. Sunglasses man chose the latter. He strutted back and announced I would be escorted to HOA headquarters for processing. Headquarters was just the community clubhouse where Sylvia liked to hold meetings. I almost laughed but kept a straight face. I nodded and agreed to go with them, but only if they provided transport. He grinned, thinking he had won, and waved me toward the SUV. Perfect. Inside that vehicle, I would capture everything. My hidden recorder, already synced to my phone, would pick up their words. I was walking into their trap, but in reality they were walking into mine. I slid into the back seat beside the retiree. He smelled faintly of aftershave and worry. The SUV engine coughed to life, and we rolled slowly down the street. Sylvia followed in her golf cart like a queen leading a parade. Neighbors watched openly now, murmuring to each other. Mike still filmed pretending to fumble with his hose. The fake cops thought they were in control, but every second their act continued, the stronger my case grew. I sat back, relaxed as if on a casual ride. They had no idea the man they tried to arrest was recording every move for a federal file. The game had entered its second stage, and I was ready. The SUV rattled along the quiet streets while I studied every detail inside. The upholstery was torn in places, and the fake radio system was nothing more than a plastic box glued to the dashboard. The retiree beside me tapped his knee nervously, while Sunglasses Man gripped the wheel as though driving a tank. The younger one, with stubble, sat up front holding the folder of blank papers I had given him. He flipped through it again as if the pages might magically change into money. His frustration grew and he snapped that I was mocking their authority. I replied calmly that I had complied and handed over what they requested. That answer made him grind his teeth, but it also exposed their lack of control. Real officers never lost composure so quickly. I kept my face neutral, but inside I smiled. Their performance was unraveling already. We pulled up to the community clubhouse. Normally it hosted birthday parties and HOA meetings filled with coffee and donuts. Today, Sylvia had transformed it into her throne room. A banner reading HOA Security Division hung crookedly across the entrance. 2 folding chairs flanked the door like sentry posts, but no one sat in them. Sylvia stood proudly at the doorway, hands on hips. She wore a sash across her blouse embroidered with the words, "Neighborhood Enforcement." The absurdity of it all would have been funny if not for the fear she created. A few nervous residents lingered nearby, whispering. They wanted to see what happened, but were too afraid to get close. Mike appeared again, leaning on his cane, pretending to stretch but holding his phone steady. Every angle mattered for evidence, and Mike was unknowingly becoming my best. Cameraman. The SUV door opened, and the retiree gestured weakly for me to step out. I complied, moving slowly, making sure my recorder caught every sound. Sylvia's eyes gleamed as she announced loudly that justice would be served today. She accused me of defying community law and setting a bad example. I asked her politely what law exactly I had broken. She waved her arms and declared unauthorized residency conduct. The words were meaningless, but she said them with such confidence. Some neighbors actually nodded. That was her power. Say nonsense with enough conviction and people hesitate to challenge it. I decided to press further. I asked her to show the statute book for these laws. She snapped that the book was internal and not for residents. That line alone would carry weight in court. Transparency is a pillar of real governance. But her secrecy screamed fraud. Inside the clubhouse, the setup looked even more ridiculous. A folding table served as a desk, stacked with citation pads printed at an office supply store. A cheap American flag leaned crookedly in the corner. On the wall hung framed certificates of achievement that clearly had been filled out by hand. HOA Security Division Volunteer of the Month, awarded to Sylvia 3 times in a row. The 3 men led me to a metal chair in the center of the room, as if I were on trial. I sat calmly, observing every detail. My recorder hummed quietly, capturing it all. Sylvia circled like a hawk, lecturing me about respect for community standards. She raised her voice, often glancing at the doorway to ensure the small crowd outside could hear. She thrived on spectacle. She wanted fear to spread like wildfire. What she did not realize was that fear would soon turn into laughter once the truth came out. The stubble-faced man slapped the folder of blank papers on the table and accused me of falsifying documents. I asked him to read aloud the supposed falsification. He stammered, flipping through empty sheets. Sylvia rushed in, declaring it was obstruction. Her improvisation grew frantic. I leaned back, relaxed. The more they exaggerated, the deeper they dug. Sunglasses Man muttered about towing my motorcycle as additional punishment. I asked if they had a contract with the county for towing rights. He froze, clearly unaware such things required legality. The retiree whispered that maybe they should stop. Sylvia snapped at him to stay quiet. That crack showed her team was not united. Cracks like that split wide open when pressure built. I decided to test the limits. I asked if I was free to leave. Sylvia shouted no and demanded I stay seated until fines were paid. I asked again who had the authority to detain me. She pointed at her sash and said she did. The absurdity nearly broke my calm facade, but I managed to stay straight-faced. Across the doorway, I noticed more neighbors gathered whispering. Janet clutched her son's hand and looked fearful yet curious. Mike whispered something to another neighbor, and I knew he was spreading the truth, that this was all a show. Once community faith slipped, Sylvia would lose everything. I wanted her downfall to be public, so nobody could claim later they had not seen the truth. Exposure was the goal, not just arrest. Sylvia leaned close, eyes blazing. She hissed that I would regret mocking her authority. I responded gently that true authority never needed threats. She recoiled as if slapped. The younger man slammed his fist on the table, demanding immediate payment. I asked him again to show me the law requiring it. He had nothing. Sylvia barked that HOA rules were above the Constitution. That single line sealed her fate. Several neighbors gasped and began filming openly. The shift was happening. Fear was giving way to courage. Sylvia realized it too, and her voice rose higher, more desperate. She ordered the men to escort me to a back room for processing. Sunglasses man gripped my arm firmly, but not professionally. His hand shook. I let him lead me because every second of this circus was another nail in her coffin. The back room was a storage closet with mops and folding chairs. They called it holding. I sat calmly while my recorder captured everything. Sylvia stormed in, demanding I sign a confession admitting to rule violations. She shoved a paper at me covered in scribbles. I pretended to study it, nodding slowly. I asked her if refusing meant escalation to federal court. She smiled wickedly and said the HOA had higher authority than federal judges. That was the final line I needed. My case was airtight. Soon she would learn what real federal authority looked like. For now, I sat silently watching her build her own downfall brick by brick. The storage closet smelled of bleach and damp cardboard. I sat on the folding chair while the three fake officers stood around, trying to look intimidating. The retiree shifted uncomfortably, while the younger one paced back and forth, muttering that I had to sign or else. Sunglasses man leaned against the wall, chewing gum loudly and pretending to be relaxed, but his twitching jaw gave him away. Sylvia loomed near the door, arms folded like she was presiding over a trial. She waved the so-called confession again, and demanded that I put my name on it. I asked her calmly what would happen if I refused. She snapped that refusal meant community exile. I tilted my head and asked if exile meant eviction or banishment. She said both with a triumphant smile. The absurdity would have been laughable if the situation were not so dangerous for the residents she bullied. I stayed seated, relaxed, with my hands folded on my lap. The recorder hidden in my watch caught every ridiculous claim. I asked Sylvia how many residents had already signed such papers. She rattled off 3 names. I recognized 2 of them as elderly homeowners who often looked nervous at meetings. They likely signed out of fear. That gave me leverage. Coercion of vulnerable residents added to the charges stacking against her. The retiree finally spoke, up saying maybe I should be given time to think. Sylvia whipped around and barked at him to shut it. Her control over her own team was cracking faster by the minute. I knew he would flip eventually. People forced into corners often chose survival over loyalty. The younger officer leaned in close, trying to look menacing. He accused me of disrespecting authority. I asked him gently which police academy he graduated from. His mouth opened, then closed. He muttered something about private training. I nodded and asked which state certified it. His face turned red. The silence that followed was heavy. Even Sunglasses man looked uneasy. I had exposed their lack of legitimacy with a single question. Sylvia tried to recover by shouting that HOA training superseded state certification. That line made even her allies glance sideways. Outside the thin closet door, I heard muffled voices. Neighbors were gathering. The tension in the community was shifting. Fear was slowly turning to doubt. Doubt was dangerous for Sylvia because once doubt spread, people stopped obeying. I leaned back in the chair and asked if I could call a lawyer. Sylvia laughed sharply and said HOA matters did not allow lawyers. I asked if that rule was written anywhere. She snapped that her word was law. That single statement sealed the impression of tyranny. It was no longer an HOA enforcing rules, but one woman inventing laws on the fly. I kept my voice calm as I asked what punishment awaited those who refused her decrees. She said proudly that they were fined until broke or forced to leave. The younger officer smirked and muttered about confiscating property. I raised my eyebrows and asked if they had legal authority for that. Sylvia cut him off quickly, realizing he had said too much. That slip alone tied her little operation to potential fraud and extortion. Minutes dragged as they debated quietly. I watched them crumble from within. The retiree rubbed his forehead, muttering that he did not sign up for this. Sylvia hissed at him, but her authority was slipping. I took the moment to lean forward and speak clearly. I told them I respected real law enforcement, but impersonation was a crime. I said calmly that everything they said and did today would have consequences. My voice stayed measured, but the words struck deep. Sunglasses Man barked that I was bluffing. The younger one asked what kind of consequences. I simply said federal. Their expressions shifted uneasily. They had no idea how close I was to revealing the truth. Not yet, though. Timing was everything. Sylvia stormed out of the closet, leaving the three men behind. I could hear her voice echoing in the clubhouse, rallying a speech about community pride and obedience. Her shrill tone carried outside. The crowd outside grew louder too. I caught fragments of neighbors questioning her words. Someone asked if this was even legal. Another demanded to see actual documents. Doubt had taken root and was spreading fast. The three men exchanged nervous glances. The retiree finally whispered that this was wrong. Sunglasses Man snarled at him to keep quiet. Stubbleface gripped the fake badge on his chest like it might give him strength. They were unraveling. I sat calmly like a stone in the middle of a storm. The door burst open and Sylvia returned, furious. She shouted that the community demanded punishment now. She ordered the men to handcuff me. Sunglasses Man pulled out a pair of cheap metal cuffs, scratched and rusty. He stepped forward, but his hand shook. I held out my wrists calmly. If they placed those cuffs on me, the crime of unlawful detention became undeniable. He hesitated, then snapped them shut around my wrists. The metal bit into my skin, but I stayed still. My watch recorder caught the sound perfectly. Evidence secured. Sylvia cackled that justice had been served. Outside gasps rose from neighbors who could see through the open doorway. Her arrogance blinded her to the fact that every second more cameras were recording. Mike shouted something about real police. Sylvia yelled back that HOA police were higher than city officers. That statement would be replayed in court until the jury laughed her out of the room. I sat in the chair, cuffed but steady. My heart rate did not rise. Years of training kept me calm. Sylvia strutted around like a queen, convinced of her victory. The men looked less certain. The retiree muttered again that this was not right. Sylvia snapped at him and accused him of weakness. I stored that away. He was already halfway out. Pressure him later and he would confess everything. Sunglasses Man tried to look tough, but his breathing was shallow. The younger one tapped his foot nervously. They were cracking under the weight of their own farce. I leaned forward and said, softly, that the truth always comes out. My words hung in the air like a blade. Sylvia smirked, but for the first time her eyes flickered with doubt. The cheap metal cuffs bit into my wrists, but I kept my breathing even. Sylvia paraded around the clubhouse floor, speaking to the neighbors who had now gathered openly in the doorway. She raised her hands and declared that the community was safe. Once again, because the HOA police had removed a dangerous element. Her voice cracked slightly under the weight of her own theatrics, but she kept going. She wanted applause. Instead, she was met with silence. The neighbors stared, not with admiration, but with confusion and unease. That silence was louder than any cheer. Mike leaned on his cane and muttered loudly enough for others to hear that this looked more like a circus than security. Several people chuckled quietly. The spell Sylvia had cast over the neighborhood was beginning to break. I shifted in the chair, letting the cuffs clink against the metal. The sound carried and caught people's attention. I spoke clearly, asking if anyone present had ever seen real police use a folding chair as a holding cell. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the crowd. Sylvia snapped at mocking authority. Was another violation. I asked her calmly to cite the violation number. She froze for a moment, then shouted that it was Rule 72 subsection C. The problem was, there were only 20 rules in the official HOA handbook. Mike pointed that out loudly and the crowd stirred again. Sylvia's face turned red, but she doubled down, claiming she had authority to create new rules on the spot. That line turned several neighbors visibly against her. Even Janet whispered angrily that this was madness. The younger officer with stubble shifted uncomfortably under the stares of the crowd. He mumbled that maybe they should wrap this up. Sylvia glared at him, but the seed of doubt was planted. The retiree looked down at his shoes, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His shoulders sagged like a man carrying regret. Sunglasses Man kept chewing his gum, but his jaw clenched harder with every passing second. They were losing control and they knew it. I stayed still, letting their own incompetence destroy them. My recorder picked up everything. Every contradiction, every fake claim, every slip of the tongue. This was evidence gold. Sylvia stomped her foot and screamed that the HOA was sovereign territory. That phrase echoed like a gunshot in the small clubhouse. Neighbors gasped. Mike barked out a laugh and asked if she planned to print passports next. The sarcasm spread like fire. For the first time, Sylvia's authority was openly mocked. Her grip was crumbling. She ordered the men to escort me outside for public shaming. Sunglasses Man hauled me to my feet and pushed me toward the door. The cuffs pinched, but I kept my balance steady. The crowd parted reluctantly as we stepped out into the sunlight. Sylvia followed, arms raised, declaring victory. She wanted the entire street to see. That was exactly what I needed. On the lawn outside the clubhouse, Sylvia demanded I kneel as an example. I refused politely. She shrieked that refusal meant maximum penalty. I asked what that penalty was. She shouted eviction and property seizure. The absurdity hit the crowd hard. Murmurs rose. Someone shouted that she had no right. Another yelled, "For real, police." The atmosphere shifted rapidly. Fear was giving way to anger. People who had stayed silent for months now found their voices. Janet stepped forward, clutching her son's hand, and asked why her boy had been fined for riding his bike. Sylvia barked that it was endangerment. Janet's voice cracked as she said it was just a child riding on the sidewalk. Neighbors nodded. In agreement, the human cost of Sylvia's reign was being laid bare. I looked around slowly and asked if any neighbor present had ever voted for an HOA police force. Silence followed. Then a man near the back shouted no. Others echoed him. Sylvia screamed that she did not need votes because authority was inherited. The absurd claim drew laughter and disbelief. Her men looked increasingly uncomfortable. The retiree whispered that he was done and stepped back away from the group. Sylvia whirled on him, furious, but the crowd erupted in support. Mike shouted that the man was right and that this nonsense needed to end. Cameras lifted higher. Phones recorded everything. Sylvia's empire was collapsing in real time. I turned to Sunglasses Man and Stubbleface and asked if they really wanted to risk prison for impersonating officers. Their eyes flickered. They knew the stakes. Sylvia screamed that they would be heroes, remembered for generations. Her words rang hollow. I leaned forward and said softly that real federal agents were already watching. That line struck like lightning. Sunglasses Man swallowed hard. Stubbleface muttered a curse. The retiree took another step back, shaking his head. Sylvia shrieked that I was lying. Her voice cracked with desperation. The crowd no longer believed her. The balance of power had shifted completely. I raised my cuffed wrists high so everyone could see. I said clearly that being detained by fake officers under fake laws was not justice but tyranny. The neighbors erupted in murmurs of agreement. Sylvia screamed over them, but her voice was drowned out. Mike shouted for someone to call the real police. Several phones dialed at once. Sylvia realized the walls were closing in. She grabbed the clipboard from Stubbleface and began scribbling, frantically claiming she was issuing emergency orders. Nobody listened. Her men looked at each other, uncertain. The retiree whispered that he was leaving and walked off entirely. The other two hesitated, trapped between loyalty and self-preservation. The crowd grew louder, chanting for release. I stood steady, letting the cuffs glint in the sunlight, like proof of her madness. Sylvia lunged forward, yanking the cuffs herself and proclaiming I was banished. I met her eyes calmly and said, "Banishment ended today." At that exact moment, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. The crowd turned their heads. Sylvia froze mid-sentence. Real law was on its way. The look on her face twisted from triumph to fear. She backed away, muttering that the HOA police would stand firm, but her trembling hands betrayed her. I straightened my shoulders, cuffs still binding me, but confidence radiating. The show was nearly over. Soon the actors, pretending at authority, would face the reality of true justice. The sound of sirens grew louder with each passing second, and the crowd shifted toward the street, eager to see what would happen. Sylvia tried to regain control, shouting that the HOA police would handle everything and that outside interference was not welcome. Her words rang hollow as the flashing lights of two black and white cruisers appeared at the end of the road. Neighbors cheered openly. Relief washed across their faces. For months they had been afraid to speak out, but now they saw hope rolling down the street. Sylvia's fake officers froze like deer in headlights. Sunglasses Man muttered that they should run. Stubbleface gripped his fake badge so tight it bent. The retiree who had already stepped away shook his head and whispered that it was over. The cruisers pulled up smoothly and two uniformed city police officers stepped out. They looked sharp and professional, their real gear gleaming in the Florida sun. The crowd parted instantly, giving them a clear path. Sylvia puffed up her chest and marched toward them, waving her sash like a flag. She announced loudly that the HOA police had already handled the situation and that city police were not needed. One of the officers raised an eyebrow and asked her to repeat herself. Sylvia insisted that she was in charge here and that community sovereignty placed her above city authority. The officer looked at her partner with an expression halfway between disbelief and amusement. Then he turned back and asked her for identification. Sylvia pulled out her laminated HOA card and held it up proudly. The officer blinked slowly before telling her that impersonating law enforcement was a serious crime. The crowd erupted in whispers. Cameras zoomed in. Sylvia's face flushed, but she refused to back down. She screamed that she was defending community safety. The officer calmly asked about the man in cuffs. I raised my wrists and stepped forward, saying clearly that I was being detained without cause by people pretending to be officers. My voice carried over the lawn and every phone captured it. The officer walked over, examined the cuffs and frowned. At the cheap design, he asked Sylvia again what authority gave her the right. She stammered something about HOA bylaws. He cut her off, telling her that no bylaw in the country allowed armed detention. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The crowd chuckled nervously. The myth of her power was collapsing. Sunglasses Man tried to back away, muttering that he wanted no part of this. The officer stopped him and demanded his ID. Stubbleface did the same, shaking visibly. The retiree stepped forward, raising his hands, and confessed that they had been pressured into this by Sylvia. His voice cracked as he said he wanted nothing more to do with it. The crowd gasped. His confession was the first domino. Sylvia shrieked at him, calling him a traitor, but the officer silenced her with a sharp command. They uncuffed me swiftly and asked if I wanted to press charges. I nodded calmly. My wrists were sore, but my composure remained. I knew this was the turning point. Sylvia realized too, and her eyes darted frantically like a cornered animal. The officers asked me for a statement, and I explained in detail everything that had happened since the morning. I kept my tone measured but firm. I pointed out the hidden recorder in my watch and explained that I had full audio evidence. Mike hobbled forward, grinning, and said he had hours of video footage on his phone. Other neighbors chimed in, showing their recordings. The officers looked overwhelmed by the sheer amount of evidence pouring in. Sylvia screamed that all recordings were illegal without her permission. The officer snapped that public recording was perfectly legal and that she had no authority to stop it. The crowd erupted in cheers. Janet hugged her son tightly, whispering that it was finally over. Relief spread across the lawn like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sylvia made one last desperate attempt. She shouted that she was protected under special HOA sovereignty laws and that anyone interfering would be sued personally. The officer shook his head and told her she was under arrest for impersonating law enforcement, unlawful detention, and harassment. He began reading her rights as he placed her in real handcuffs. The crowd gasped, then cheered louder than ever before. For the first time, Sylvia's power crumbled entirely. She thrashed and screamed, kicking at the ground, but the officers held her steady. She shouted that the HOA would avenge her, but nobody listened. Her words were drowned out by applause and laughter. Sunglasses Man and Stubbleface were also taken aside, questioned, and warned of potential charges. The retiree was allowed to step back since he confessed and cooperated. As Sylvia was placed in the cruiser, she locked eyes with me. Hatred burned in her stare, but behind it flickered fear. She shouted that this was not the end. I remained calm, watching as the door shut and the vehicle pulled away. The crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with excitement. Some hugged each other. Others shook my hand, thanking me for standing up. Janet whispered her gratitude, saying her son could finally ride his bike without fear. Mike slapped me on the back, grinning ear to ear. He said he had enough footage to make a documentary. I chuckled quietly. The neighborhood was finally breathing again. The officers stayed to collect statements. One of them pulled me aside and asked how I had stayed so calm. I told him that training helped. He raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. I smiled faintly but said nothing more. The time to reveal the deeper truth was not yet. Sylvia's arrest was only the surface. Beneath it ran currents of fraud, extortion, and corruption that reached further than anyone suspected. For now, I let the neighbors celebrate their victory. The storm had only just begun, but the foundation of the case was set in stone. Soon the bigger picture would come into focus, and Sylvia would not be the only one facing justice. The flashing lights faded as the cruisers drove away, with Sylvia in the back, still shouting from behind the glass. Neighbors lingered on the lawn, buzzing with energy, replaying what they had just witnessed. Mike hobbled over, leaning heavily on his cane, and whispered that he had never seen anyone handle her that way. I smiled faintly and told him she was only the beginning. He tilted his head, puzzled, but said nothing more. I could feel the weight of the bigger case pressing in. Everything Sylvia had done today was a piece of a much larger puzzle. The question was how much of it the neighbors were ready to hear. For now, I kept quiet and walked back toward my house, with Rusty padding along loyally at my side. His presence calmed me as always. The cuffs had left faint marks on my wrists, but they would fade. What mattered now was timing. That evening, the neighborhood group chat exploded with messages. Some praised the police, others mocked Sylvia's meltdown. Screenshots of her being cuffed were shared dozens of times. Janet sent a heartfelt thank you message, saying she finally felt safe. I typed a short reply telling them justice had just started. I left it at that. Meanwhile, in my home office, I pulled up files on my laptop. Behind the mundane farkaday of a suburban resident, I had secure connections into federal systems. The HOA police farce was ridiculous, but the money trail behind it was not. Sylvia had been moving large sums through shell accounts tied to a private security contractor already under investigation. That contractor was suspected of laundering money for organized fraud networks. My cover assignment placed me here for a reason. Sylvia was not just a nuisance neighbor, she was a link. I reviewed the audio from my watch recorder. Every absurd statement, every unlawful threat was crystal clear. That would strengthen the smaller local case. But layered on top were the financial records I had been quietly gathering. Payments from residents forced to buy fake security decals had been funneled through the contractor. From there, funds were moved offshore. The scam was larger than anyone in Pinewood Heights realized. I sipped black coffee as I organized the evidence. The bureau would want a clean chain of custody. I had to be careful not to blow my cover too early. Neighbors saw me as just another homeowner. That illusion was my shield. If the larger network caught wind that a federal agent was embedded here, they might vanish before we could take them down. The next morning, Mike knocked on my door carrying a thermos of coffee. He looked around nervously and asked if he could step inside. Once seated at my table, he leaned in and whispered that he had more footage. He slid a flash drive across the table. I asked what was on it. He said he had been running cameras on the block for months because he never trusted Sylvia. His voice shook slightly, but there was pride behind it. He admitted he caught more than HOA harassment. He had seen people coming and going at night, unloading boxes into Sylvia's garage. Men he had never seen before. My pulse quickened. This was the missing link. I asked if he told anyone else. He shook his head, saying he wanted me to see first, because I seemed like the only one not scared of her. I thanked him sincerely and promised the footage would help more than he realized. That night, I reviewed the videos. Grainy clips showed vans pulling up after midnight. Figures in hoodies carried crates marked with faint logos of the security contractor. They disappeared into Sylvia's garage, then left empty-handed. The pattern repeated every few weeks. This was no longer just about fake tickets and harassment. This was supply chain smuggling disguised as neighborhood enforcement. I logged everything, carefully encrypting copies for the bureau. The operation was bigger than I expected. Sylvia had played queen, but she was also a pawn in something deeper. The question was who her handler really was. Days passed and neighbors relaxed in Sylvia's absence. They held a casual barbecue on the green for the first time in months. Laughter filled the air, children ran freely, bikes rolled without fear. But even in that joy, I kept my eyes scanning. Peace in Pinewood Heights was fragile. I noticed a black SUV parked too long at the end of the street, out of place, tinted windows. I logged the plate mentally. That night, I ran it through secure channels. The plate traced back to a shell company tied to the same contractor. My suspicion hardened into certainty. The arrest of Sylvia had stirred the hornet's nest. They were watching now, which meant the time to act was closing in. Late that night, I received a coded message on my secure line. My handler confirmed the contractor was under active surveillance, and my intel was critical. They approved escalation. Phase 2 would begin soon. That meant backup. That meant I would no longer be alone in this. I sat back in my chair listening to the quiet hum of the house. Rusty lay at my feet, head resting on his paws. I scratched behind his ears and whispered that the storm was only beginning. His tail thumped softly against the floor. He did not understand the scale of the danger, but his steady presence grounded me. Tomorrow I would step back into the role of the unassuming neighbor, but the mask was cracking. Sooner rather than later the truth would come out, and when it did, the so-called HOA police would look like children playing dress-up compared to what their backers were about to face. The days after Sylvia's arrest carried an odd calm. The neighbors basked in the relief of freedom while I kept my guard raised. Barbecues sprouted up on weekends. Children chalked the sidewalks with bright colors. People laughed again. But beneath that peace, I felt the shift of currents. A predator moves when prey grows comfortable. I spent hours reviewing Mike's footage again, frame by frame. The crates moving through Sylvia's garage were not random. Some bore faint barcodes of electronics importers. Others were blank. Each delivery was logged at the same time as wire transfers passing through the contractor's accounts. This was smuggling disguised as neighborhood enforcement. The HOA police were just a mask. The real face of the operation lurked in shadows beyond Pinewood Heights. One afternoon, while jogging with Rusty, I noticed the black SUV again, parked 2 blocks down facing toward the playground. The same tinted glass, the same stillness. I slowed my pace and tied my shoe deliberately while scanning reflections. A figure sat in the driver's seat, head bent low, as if pretending to read. I memorized the plate and jogged on. When I checked later through bureau systems, the shell company connection was undeniable. They were watching me. They had not moved yet, which meant they were uncertain. Sylvia's meltdown had disrupted the pattern. Whoever controlled the flow of goods was nervous. Nervous enemies make mistakes. I just had to be ready to catch them. That night Janet knocked on my door holding her son's hand. She thanked me again, but her face carried worry. She said strange men had approached her the previous evening, asking if she would testify against Sylvia. They claimed to be legal aids, but wore no IDs. They pressed too hard. She told them no, but could not shake the feeling she was being followed. Her son clung close to her side. I reassured her firmly that she had done the right thing and promised she would be safe. After she left, I closed the door and exhaled slowly. The network was probing the edges. They wanted to see who would talk. That meant pressure on more neighbors would come soon. It also meant time was running out for me to remain just another resident. The following morning I found a letter slipped under my door. Plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a single sheet typed in block letters. It warned me to stop interfering with matters beyond my reach. It mentioned Rusty by name. My jaw tightened as I folded the paper. Threats were the final step before escalation. I scanned the letter for prints, then burned a copy for bureau records. My handler would need to see this, but I chose not to alert the neighbors yet. Panic would only serve the enemy. Better to keep the surface calm while preparing the counterstrike. Later that day, Mike came knocking again. He looked tired but determined. He said he had reviewed more of his recordings and spotted license plates on the vans. We sat at my kitchen table while he jotted numbers in shaky handwriting. He admitted he was scared but could not let this go. He had lived in the neighborhood 30 years and would not see it turned into a criminal depot. I placed a hand on his shoulder and thanked him sincerely. His courage mattered more than he realized. He grinned faintly, saying he always wanted to play detective but never thought it would come to this. In his humor I found strength. Side characters like Mike carried the backbone of truth when fear silenced others. That night, I transmitted everything to the bureau. My handler replied swiftly, authorizing deeper intervention. They confirmed that the contractor was linked to a wider fraud ring using HOA fronts across multiple states. Pinewood Heights was only one hub. Sylvia was a pawn, but behind her stood architects far more dangerous. The bureau would move soon, but they needed me to keep eyes on the ground until the operation was ready. That meant my cover was at its edge. I looked at Rusty sleeping soundly near the couch. His steady breathing filled the silence. I whispered to him that our quiet life here was almost over. 2 nights later, the SUV did more than watch. It followed. While driving back from the grocery store, I noticed headlights trailing too steadily. I turned twice through side streets. The SUV mirrored my moves. My pulse quickened, but my hands stayed steady. I pulled calmly into my driveway, unloading groceries slowly. The SUV rolled past without stopping, but I caught a glimpse of the driver's eyes in the mirror. Cold, watchful, calculating. I knew then my cover was not just thinning, it was pierced. They suspected me. The question was whether they knew who I really was. I could not let that truth surface too soon. If the word FBI spread prematurely, the larger network would scatter like ash in the wind. The next morning, a community notice appeared taped to every mailbox. It was written as if from the HOA board, though no meeting had been held. It declared a reinstatement of HOA security patrols under temporary leadership until Sylvia's return. The notice warned residents that outsiders might pretend to be law enforcement and that only HOA-approved officers were to be trusted. The irony was sharp. They were already preparing to fill the gap Sylvia left with new faces. The network was moving fast. They wanted control back before the neighbors realized true freedom was possible. I read the notice carefully and tucked it into my file. Another breadcrumb. That evening at sunset, I stood on the porch with Rusty watching children play down the street. The cicadas droned in steady rhythm. Neighbors waved happily, but I felt the weight of storm clouds on the horizon. My cover as Daniel, the quiet homeowner, was days away from collapsing. Soon they would push harder, and the neighborhood would be pulled into the gravity of the larger case. I could keep the mask a little longer, but the truth was clawing its way up. When it broke through, it would change everything. Pinewood Heights thought they had seen drama when Sylvia was arrested. They had no idea how deep the roots of corruption truly reached. The neighborhood slept under a false calm for only a few more days before the charade returned. On a Saturday morning, loud knocks echoed across Pinewood Heights as 3 new so-called HOA police strutted down the street. Their uniforms looked sharper than Sylvia's old crew, black shirts pressed clean with fake patches sewn on the sleeves. They carried cheap radios clipped to their belts and plastic cuffs dangling like props. The neighbors who had once laughed at Sylvia now looked uneasy again. Janet pulled her son inside and closed the curtains. Mike filmed from behind his blinds, whispering into his phone. I stood on my porch watching silently as the trio approached my driveway. The leader was a heavy-set man with slicked hair and mirrored sunglasses. He barked that my lawn length was in violation of community standards and that I was being cited. His tone was forceful, but his words had no authority. I asked calmly under what statute he was operating. He smirked and replied that HOA police codes gave him full arrest powers. My patience thinned, but I kept my voice steady. I told him impersonating law enforcement was a crime and that I would not comply. He laughed nervously and called to his partners. They stepped forward, gripping their fake cuffs as if ready to use them. I could see their hesitation though. They wanted the image of power, but not the risk of a real fight. Neighbors peeked from windows, recording every second. The pressure of eyes weighed heavy on the imposters. Still, the leader puffed his chest and said, I had one last chance to cooperate. I took a single step closer and lowered my voice so only he could hear. I told him that one wrong move today would end his game permanently. His smirk faltered. He asked what I meant. I met his eyes steadily without a blink. For a moment, the mask of Daniel, the quiet homeowner, slipped just enough. He saw something behind my calm that unsettled him. He barked for his men to step back, pretending it was his command. They retreated a few feet, muttering to each other. The crowd's phones captured every second. The illusion cracked again. The imposters regrouped at the end of the street, muttering angrily. They handed out flyers, declaring new HOA security protocols and warning residents not to trust city police. Some neighbors laughed openly at the absurdity, while others looked shaken. Janet texted me saying she feared they would come back at night. Mike messaged that he was uploading footage to a secure folder. I thanked them both, but cautioned patience. Every action of these imposters only tightened the net around them. The Bureau was watching now, more closely than ever. What the neighbors saw as a nuisance, I saw as evidence piling higher with each bluff. That evening, Mike knocked on my door again. His eyes shone with excitement. He said he recognized one of the new recruits. He used to work security at the mall but had been fired for theft. Mike swore he could dig up his old name tag as proof. I smiled and told him to hold on to it. Every scrap of information mattered. Mike chuckled, saying he never thought his dusty boxers would help take down crooks. His humor cut through the tension like a warm knife. He left humming a tune, leaving me with the reminder that even ordinary people could tip scales when courage met truth. Later that night, headlights swept across my window. I moved silently to the side and peered out. A van idled in front of Sylvia's dark house. Two figures unloaded a crate and rolled it inside quickly before driving off. My camera caught the entire scene. The crate bore the same faint logo from Mike's earlier footage. They had resumed operations. They believed the neighborhood was cowed enough to ignore. But this time, every step was documented under federal watch. I encrypted the video and sent it through secure channels. The reply from my handler came within minutes. Operation Escalation authorized reinforcements would be staged within the week. My role was to maintain cover until the strike. The next morning, the imposters returned, swaggering down the street. This time, they carried printed citations demanding payment of fines in cash to a P.O. box. Neighbors gasped at the audacity. Janet confronted them from her porch, demanding to know what gave them authority. They shouted back that community loyalty required sacrifice. The absurd theater would have been comical if not for the fear it spread. I stepped forward again, calm but firm. I told them the neighborhood would not comply and that their presence was documented and reported. Their leader sneered, asking who I thought I was. I let silence hang heavy, then replied that he would find out soon enough. His face paled, though he masked it with laughter. As they stormed off, muttering, I felt the eyes of the neighborhood on me. Mike stepped out, applauding sarcastically. Others followed, clapping lightly. Confidence rippled through Pinewood Heights. They no longer hid behind curtains. They began to stand together. The imposters saw it too, and their power drained visibly. Authority built on fear crumbles when fear evaporates. I knew the days ahead would bring confrontation. They would either retreat or lash out violently. Either way, the Bureau was ready. I stroked Rusty's head as he sat at my side, calm and watchful. He tilted his head, sensing the tension. I whispered that the mask was nearly gone. Soon they would know who I really was, and the game of pretend police would end in chains. The fakes HOA police were growing restless. Their paper citations had been mocked online, and neighbors were sharing them as jokes. Authority was slipping through their fingers. That loss of control made them dangerous. By midweek, I sensed they were planning something bolder. The black SUV circled twice during the night and parked near the playground. Rusty growled softly from the window, sensing what I already knew. Pressure was building. I filed my reports quickly and waited. When desperate men need to reassert power, they overreach. That would be their mistake. On Thursday morning, a knock rattled my door louder than before. I opened it to find the same trio plus two new recruits standing in formation. They wore dark sunglasses and had slapped tin badges on their chests that gleamed cheaply in the sun. The leader announced loudly that I was under arrest for repeated violations of HOA security law. His words carried a rehearsed cadence but none of the legal weight. Neighbors gathered across lawns, whispering nervously. Janet stood on her porch, clutching her son's hand. Mike recorded openly with his camcorder, muttering commentary under his breath. I asked them what authority gave them power to arrest a homeowner. The leader puffed his chest and declared that Pinewood Heights bylaws authorized detention of non-compliant residents. His words barely disguised the tremor in his voice. I told him calmly that impersonating a police officer was a felony punishable by prison. He smirked and ordered two men forward with plastic cuffs. They stepped up hesitantly, but placed their hands on my arms. The moment had arrived. I could not allow them to escalate further. I let them grip my wrists for a second, then twisted free. With controlled force, gasps echoed from the crowd. I pulled a black leather wallet from my pocket and flipped it open. The gold and blue shield gleamed in the sunlight. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words hung heavy over the street. The imposters froze. One dropped his cuffs in shock. Murmurs spread through the neighbors like wildfire. Mike cheered loudly, pumping his fist. Janet covered her mouth in astonishment. The leader stammered, asking if this was a joke. I held the badge steady and said, clearly that I was a special agent of the FBI, assigned to investigate organized fraud and impersonation of law enforcement. Every second of their actions had been recorded and transmitted. Their uniforms, their citations, their threats. All of it was evidence in a federal case. The leader's smirk crumbled into panic. He glanced at his men but found no support. They backed away, slowly realizing their game had ended. Before they could scatter, black SUVs rolled into the cul-de-sac. Doors swung open and real federal agents stepped out in tactical vests. Commands rang sharp and professional. The imposters were ordered to the ground. They hesitated only briefly before dropping to their knees. Zip ties snapped around their wrists. Neighbors gasped and filmed with phones, capturing every angle. The spectacle was undeniable. The fake HOA police had been exposed under the harsh light of federal authority. Sylvia's legacy of intimidation crumbled completely in that moment. Pinewood Heights stood united, not in fear but in vindication. As the agents secured the imposters, I briefed the lead supervisor quickly. Evidence had been transmitted for weeks. Financial records linked the operation to the contractor under investigation. The garage crates, the cash fines, the offshore transfers, all tied neatly into a network of fraud. The supervisor nodded, confirming the bureau was ready to roll up connected sites across the state. Pinewood Heights was only one spoke of the wheel, but it was the spoke that cracked the hub. My cover had served its purpose. Now the neighborhood knew the truth, and the case had teeth. Neighbors swarmed me with questions. Was I really FBI? How long had I been undercover? Was Rusty trained by the bureau too? I smiled faintly and answered what I could. I explained that I had lived quietly among them, not to spy on residents but to gather evidence on the fraud disguised as HOA enforcement. Their courage in standing up had given the case strength. Janet thanked me with tears in her eyes, saying she finally felt safe. Mike slapped my back proudly, declaring he always suspected I was more than just a quiet neighbor. His laughter echoed with relief. For the first time in months, Pinewood Heights felt like a real community, not a captive audience to bullies. As the imposters were loaded into vans, I caught sight of the leader staring at me with rage mixed with fear. He shouted that this was not over, that others higher up would come for me. I met his gaze calmly and told him the law always rises above fear. The door slammed and the van pulled away. The crowd erupted into cheers. Children waved flags hastily, grabbed from porches. The neighborhood that once trembled under the shadow of a fake police force now stood in the glow of justice. My badge glinted in the setting sun as Rusty pressed against my leg, tail wagging steadily. The fight was far from over, but Pinewood Heights had crossed a threshold. The line between intimidation and freedom had been redrawn in bold strokes, and this time the neighborhood knew it could stand on the right side of it. The day after the arrests, the neighborhood felt like a carnival. Children played freely in yards, without parents calling them back in fear. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, trading stories of harassment, now told with laughter instead of dread. Mike strutted around with his camcorder dangling proudly from his neck, telling anyone who would listen that he filmed the whole down. Janet baked cookies for the agents who lingered in the area. For a brief moment, Pinewood Heights tasted pure freedom, yet beneath the joy I sensed the ripple of something darker. Fraud networks do not collapse quietly. They recoil before they break. That evening my handler called with updates. The raids connected to our case had begun. Warehouses in 3 counties were searched, and crates of stolen electronics were recovered. Bank accounts tied to the fake citations had been frozen. Several suspects were taken into custody, but some figures remained at large, and intelligence suggested they were not pleased with the way Pinewood Heights had become ground zero for exposure. My cover was no longer useful, but my presence remained necessary. The bureau wanted me to stay, embedded until all loose ends were tied. I agreed, but knew that retaliation would come sooner rather than later. 2 nights later, I noticed new cars parked on the edges of the community. Not the black SUV this time, but older sedans, with tinted windows and no plates visible. They never stayed long, but rotated in shifts. Surveillance, testing the waters. Rusty growled each time he caught their scent. I walked him calmly down the block, pretending to be oblivious while scanning reflections in windows. Their faces were unfamiliar, outsiders drawn in by the collapse of Sylvia's scheme. The bigger network was probing. They wanted to know who had betrayed them and how deep the bureau's knowledge ran. The neighbors sensed unease too. Janet confided that she felt watched again. Mike said his mail had been tampered with. Others whispered of strange calls asking questions about the FBI presence. Fear threatened to creep back in, but this time the residents were not powerless. They rallied together, forming a watch group of their own. Families took turns checking on each other. Mike set up more cameras, even lending a spare to Janet. Their unity warmed me. The community was learning resilience. They were no longer prey, waiting for a predator. They were eyes and ears, and that made them allies. But one morning a package arrived on my porch with no return address. Inside was a broken badge, the same cheap tin style the imposters wore but snapped in half. A warning. I photographed it and sent it to my handler, then locked it away. Later that day, a neighbor spotted two men near Sylvia's vacant house. When confronted, they claimed to be maintenance workers but carried no tools. They left quickly. When questioned, I walked the perimeter myself and found a rear window tampered with. The message was clear. Someone wanted to reclaim Sylvia's house as a base. They did not realize every attempt only strengthened the federal case. At a community gathering that weekend, the residents asked me directly what would happen next. They wanted reassurance that the nightmare was truly over. I chose my words carefully. I told them justice was a process, not a single event. The arrests had crippled the local fraud, but higher figures might still attempt to manipulate. I urged them to stay united and vigilant. Mike raised his camcorder, declaring that if any crook stepped foot on Pinewood Heights again, he would have them on tape before they could blink. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Courage was building. Hope was louder than fear. That night, as Rusty lay at my feet, I thought of how far the neighborhood had come. From Sylvia's clipboard tyranny to fake police trying to drag me away, and now to a community discovering its own strength. Yet I knew the larger battle was not over. The network wanted silence, and I was the loudest voice of defiance. My cover was gone, but my duty remained. Pinewood Heights had become more than an assignment. It was home, and home deserved defending, even if the storm had only paused rather than ended. The following week, court proceedings began against the arrested. I testified under oath, explaining how they had impersonated law enforcement and attempted an unlawful arrest. Mike's footage and Janet's statements reinforced every point. The judge listened intently, noting the severity of their actions. The defendants tried to downplay their roles, claiming they thought they were volunteering for community security. But the financial records and printed citations exposed their lies. Convictions were certain. The courtroom buzzed with neighbors, filling benches to witness justice firsthand. The imposters avoided my eyes, but I felt their resentment burning. They had played at authority and now faced real consequences. After court, Janet approached me with gratitude. She said she could finally sleep at night without checking locks twice. Her son smiled for the first time in months, running ahead without fear. Mike slapped my back, saying the neighborhood should throw me a parade. I laughed softly, but inside I felt the weight of unfinished business. The smaller fish had been caught, but the larger sharks swam freely. The fraud ring stretched beyond county lines into circles still hidden. Until they were exposed, the shadow lingered. As I walked back through Pinewood Heights, at dusk, I watched porch lights flicker on one by one. Families gathered for dinner. Children shouted games across lawns. The sound was pure life, unbroken by fear. Rusty trotted beside me, tail swishing contently. I whispered to him that the fight was not finished, but tonight we had earned peace. He barked once, as if in agreement. Ahead of us, the street lay calm, but my instincts warned it was the eye of a storm. Somewhere out there, the bigger players were regrouping, and when they came for us, Pinewood Heights would not face them alone. This time, the community knew the truth, and the truth was stronger than any badge made of tin. The calm did not last. A week after the courtroom hearings, strange vans began circling Pinewood Heights at odd hours. They parked just outside the gates, headlights off, engines running. Rusty bristled each time he heard their low, idle growl. My instincts screamed that this was no coincidence. These were not the bumbling imposters who had worn tin badges. These were men with money and backing. The larger network was flexing its muscle. I filed reports and was told to maintain vigilance. Reinforcements were staged but not yet released. Until then, it was me and a neighborhood still learning how to stand tall. Mike knocked late one night holding a memory card. He whispered that his cameras caught two men trespassing near Janet's yard. They carried crowbars and scanned the street before retreating. He joked nervously about charging them rent for starring in his footage, but I could see the fear beneath. His humor, I loaded the card into my secure laptop. The faces matched known associates from the fraud network. The Bureau would have enough for arrest warrants soon, but the network was testing limits. They wanted to see if Pinewood Heights had fallen back into fear. They were about to learn that fear no longer lived here. The next day, Janet rallied neighbors. In her driveway, she suggested forming shifts to patrol at night. Families signed up eagerly. Retirees who once stayed silent volunteered to keep watch from porches. Even teenagers offered to help walk the streets in groups. The sense of unity swelled. Pinewood Heights transformed from a cluster of isolated homes into a single beating heart. Mike called it the Pinewood Posse, and neighbors laughed but embraced the name. Their solidarity turned intimidation into a community shield. I reminded them to stay safe and leave confrontation to the Bureau. Still, their courage mattered. Unity itself was a weapon. That night, the vans returned. Instead of hiding, neighbors stood in small groups with flashlights beaming directly at the vehicles. The silent stare-down rattled the intruders. Engines roared as the vans sped away. Cheers broke out. For the first time, the community pushed back without fear. Mike uploaded the footage online where it spread quickly. Comments poured in praising the neighborhood's courage. The fraud network surely saw it too. Their tactics of shadow and intimidation were losing power. They had underestimated how resilient people could become once lies were stripped away. Days later, escalation came. A man posing as a delivery worker approached my house. Rusty barked sharply, sensing danger. I opened the door cautiously and asked what the package was. He stammered with a fake name, then lunged, suddenly shoving the box toward me. I sidestepped, and Rusty lunged, barking ferociously. The man bolted, dropping the package, which contained nothing but bricks wrapped in tape. A crude threat meant to rattle. Instead, it fueled resolve. Neighbors rushed over, hearing the commotion. Janet shouted that enough was enough. Mike filmed every detail and uploaded it within minutes. The attempt at intimidation backfired spectacularly. Sympathy for Pinewood Heights spread further. The fraud network's mask was slipping under public scrutiny. My handler called that evening with new orders. Surveillance confirmed the network planned a larger move. They wanted to reclaim Sylvia's house and reassert dominance. But the Bureau was ready. A coordinated sweep would occur soon. Until then, I was to remain calm and ensure neighbors stayed alert. I agreed. The storm was about to break again, but this time the neighborhood would not face it blind. Knowledge and solidarity were our armor. 2 nights later, headlights flooded Sylvia's driveway. A group of men in dark clothes unloaded equipment. Neighbors texted alerts instantly. I slipped out with Rusty at my side. From shadows, I filmed their movements. They carried boxes marked with the same fake security logo. Evidence stacked higher. Before they could set up, fully federal SUVs roared into the cul-de-sac. Tactical teams poured out, shouting commands. The men froze, stunned by the speed of the response. Within minutes, they were restrained and vehicles impounded. Neighbors erupted into cheers again. Children clapped from windows. The neighborhood that once cowered under Sylvia's petty tyranny now stood behind. Federal shields with courage of its own. As agents processed the scene, Mike strutted up, declaring this was better than television. Janet hugged her son tightly, tears of relief streaming. Families gathered together on the street, united in victory. The fraud network had lost another battle, yet I knew deeper layers remained. The captured men were muscle, not masterminds. The Bureau would interrogate them, but higher figures still pulled strings. Pinewood Heights was safer for now, but the storm had not fully passed. I looked at Rusty sitting calm beside me, his steady gaze meeting mine. He reminded me silently that vigilance was our constant duty. Later that night, as the neighborhood celebrated, I sat on my porch reflecting. The case had grown beyond a simple investigation of imposters. It had become a testament to resilience. Community, once fractured by fear, had welded itself together into a shield of unity. Even if the network tried again, they would not find easy prey here. Pinewood Heights had learned to fight back, and I was proud to stand with them, not only as an agent, but as a neighbor. Still, I knew the final act was approaching. The masterminds would not watch silently as their empire crumbled. They would strike harder, and when they did, we would be ready. The calm after the raid was deceptive. Pinewood Heights buzzed with confidence, but I knew better. Networks like these never surrendered quietly. They regrouped, they plotted, they lashed out. My handler confirmed it the following morning. Interrogations revealed that a higher tier of leadership was furious. The men arrested at Sylvia's house were expendable. The real masterminds were preparing to strike back, not with cheap tricks or fake uniforms, but with force meant to silence me. My assignment shifted from undercover observation to active defense. The Bureau prepared for confrontation, but until it came, I lived between two worlds, agent and neighbor, protector and target. That evening, an unfamiliar black sedan crept through the cul-de-sac. Its windows rolled down just enough for a camera lens to emerge. Mike spotted it first and shouted, "Across the street, that paparazzi hours were over." Neighbors laughed, but I read the scene differently. Surveillance meant escalation. They wanted my face, my habits, my vulnerabilities. I walked Rusty calmly but positioned him between me and the vehicle. The sedan lingered, then sped away. Rusty growled low. He sensed the danger like a compass. Pointing north, 2 days later, the first direct threat arrived. A letter slipped under my door. No envelope, just scrawled handwriting across a folded sheet. "Leave Pinewood Heights or watch it burn." The phrasing was crude, but the intent sharp. I photographed it, sealed it in evidence bags, and sent copies to the Bureau. Neighbors gathered when they saw the police arrive. Janet clutched her son tightly, asking if we were all safe. I reassured her that security was in place, but inside I felt the weight of the coming storm. Threats on paper often preceded violence in reality. The Bureau increased presence subtly. Unmarked cars rotated through streets. Agents walked disguised as joggers or delivery drivers. But I could sense the masterminds circling closer. They underestimated the resolve of Pinewood Heights. Unity had transformed fear into vigilance. When suspicious vans appeared again, neighbors didn't panic. They pulled out phones. They logged plates. They reported details instantly. The network's tactics of intimidation had lost effectiveness. Every move they made added to our evidence. One evening, as I sat on the porch, Rusty lifted his head and barked sharply. A figure lurked near the fence line. I moved swiftly, flashlight slicing the darkness. The intruder bolted, but not before I caught his face in the beam. Recognition hit me. He was Victor Hargrove, Sylvia's estranged brother. For months, rumors swirled that he distanced himself from her antics. But now, here he was, skulking near my yard. I reported it immediately. Hours later, Victor was questioned and, under pressure, confessed reluctantly. Sylvia's downfall had embarrassed him, and he claimed the network pressured him to monitor me. His testimony connected dots we had long suspected. The masterminds were closer than imagined. Days blurred as preparations escalated. Court dates for the imposters approached, and pressure mounted on the network to silence witnesses. I advised neighbors to remain cautious. Janet organized carpools so children were never alone. Mike installed more cameras than some police stations. The neighborhood hummed with vigilance. Fear transformed into a kind of determination. They would not be cowed again. The mastermind's shadow only strengthened their resolve. Then came the night of fire. At 2 in the morning, flames erupted near Sylvia's abandoned house. Gasoline cans were discovered at the scene. Someone had tried to send a message. Neighbors woke in panic, rushing with hoses and buckets. Agents moved swiftly to contain the blaze before it spread. The fire was doused, but the intent was undeniable. They wanted chaos. They wanted terror. Instead, they sparked unity. By dawn, neighbors stood together surveying charred remains. Eyes were tired but spirits unbroken. Janet declared that Pinewood Heights had already endured worse and would endure this too. Applause spread. Their courage was unshakable. The Bureau interpreted the fire as the final act of desperation. Plans accelerated. A sting operation was set in motion. My role was to continue living visibly, drawing attention, while undercover teams tracked communications. The masterminds would not remain faceless much longer. Every threat, every attempt at intimidation was weaving a tighter noose. Soon they would step from shadows into cuffs. But I knew the risk grew with each hour. Rusty sat at my side, watchful and steady. His presence grounded me in the storm. That evening, I walked through Pinewood Heights slowly, neighbors waving from porches. Children rode bikes without fear. Mike shouted that if the masterminds showed up, he'd give them a starring role in his next documentary. Laughter followed, but beneath it lay nerves. Everyone sensed the climax approaching. The fraud empire that had disguised itself with clipboards and citations was unraveling. The final confrontation loomed as the sun set, casting the street in amber light. I felt the air thicken with anticipation. The masterminds had tried fear, threats, surveillance, even fire. None of it broke Pinewood Heights. Soon they would show themselves because pride and desperation demanded it. And when they did, the Bureau would be ready. I looked at Rusty, who gazed back with calm faith. Together we had carried the neighborhood through storms. Now, the final wave approached, and this time it would break, not on us, but on those who thought they could play at power without. Facing the true weight of justice, the neighborhood braced itself for the inevitable. After the fire, it was no longer a question of if the masterminds would act, but when the Bureau tightened surveillance. Drones hovered discreetly above tree lines. Agents disguised as landscapers trimmed hedges while scanning signals. The sting was prepared like a chess match. The goal was to lure the masterminds into the open with their own arrogance. They had tasted control for too long and would not accept defeat quietly. My role was simple but dangerous. I had to remain visible. I had to be the bait. For days, nothing happened. The calm stretched long enough that neighbors began to hope it was over. Children played in sprinklers. Families grilled outside. Mike joked that maybe the crooks took early retirement, but I knew silence was camouflage. The bigger the move, the deeper the patience behind it. Rusty sensed it too. He stayed close, never wandering far from my side. His steady eyes followed every sound. Animals often know storms before people. I trusted his instincts as much as my own. It began on a Saturday afternoon. A white moving truck rolled through the gate, claiming to deliver furniture to a vacant home. The guard waved them in, unaware of the deception. Inside the truck sat not furniture, but men in dark clothes carrying equipment. Surveillance teams caught it instantly and alerted command. I received the call seconds later. The masterminds were making their move. Their goal was simple. They planned to stage a fake eviction of me. With forged documents and intimidation, they hoped to scare neighbors into silence and remove the one obstacle standing in their path. But they had walked directly into the web the Bureau spun. The truck stopped in front of my house. Men poured out wearing imitation uniforms with patches reading community enforcement. They carried clipboards and radios, but under their vests, weapons bulged. Neighbors froze in doorways, uncertain. Mike lifted his camera, but agents disguised as joggers waved him to hold. The sting required patience. I stepped onto the porch with Rusty beside me. The leader shouted that my property was being seized under authority of the Homeowners Alliance. His voice carried arrogance dripping with false power. Neighbors gasped. Some believed the act for a moment. That was the mastermind's play. Overwhelmed with confidence, I asked calmly what law gave them such authority. He waved papers in the air declaring them official. I took one step closer, forcing him to hand them over. My training told me instantly they were forgeries. Stamps were blurred, signatures mismatched, watermarks absent, amateur attempts at legitimacy. I raised my voice so the neighborhood could hear. These documents are fake. No community organization overrides federal law. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Doubt cracked their illusion. That was the opening we needed. At that moment, unmarked SUVs screeched into the street. Doors flew open and agents in tactical gear fanned out. Commands thundered. Drop your weapons. Get on the ground. The imposters froze, wide-eyed as the trap snapped shut. Some tried to run, but neighbors shouted directions, guiding agents to cut off escape. Mike filmed every second, his laughter ringing through the chaos. Janet clutched her son as relief washed over her. The illusion of power crumbled. Under real authority, within minutes the masterminds were restrained, wrists cuffed, equipment seized, truck impounded. The sting was complete. The leader snarled at me as agents dragged him away. He hissed that I ruined everything. I met his eyes and replied evenly that justice ruins fraud. His expression twisted with fury, but the fight was over. Neighbors erupted into cheers. Children clapped. The cul-de-sac filled with triumph. For the first time, Pinewood Heights truly believed the nightmare was ending. The masterminds themselves were in custody. Their fake empire had collapsed under the weight of law. As agents processed the scene, neighbors gathered around me. They asked if it was finally over. I told them the arrests were significant, but investigations would continue. Networks this large often had more layers. Yet the core had been dismantled. The men who orchestrated intimidation, fraud, and threats were gone. Pinewood Heights had endured the worst storm and stood unbroken. Unity had carried them through. Rusty sat proudly at my side, tail wagging as if sensing victory. That night, the Bureau held a briefing. Evidence seized from the truck and homes tied directly to interstate fraud and money laundering. Dozens more arrests would follow across the state. The case that began with fake HOA citations had grown into a full racketeering takedown. My assignment was nearing completion. I listened silently, but inside felt pride. The neighborhood I had protected had also protected me. Their vigilance and courage made the operation possible. Pinewood Heights was no longer a cluster of frightened families. It was a community forged in fire and deception, but stronger because of it. As I walked home under a quiet sky, porch lights twinkled like stars along the street. Families waved from doorways. Mike called out, asking when Hollywood would buy the movie rights. Laughter followed. Janet smiled with relief etched into every line of her face. Rusty trotted happily, knowing peace was near. I realized then that this assignment had changed me too. I came here as an agent. I would leave as a neighbor. Pinewood Heights was more than a case file. It had become part of me. The masterminds were gone. The fraud empire shattered. But one chapter remained to close. Court awaited. And in that courtroom, the truth would be laid bare for the world to see. Pinewood Heights would no longer be whispered about as a victim of scams. It would be remembered as the place where ordinary people stood firm against fraud and won. The final act was approaching, and I was ready to see it through. The courthouse was packed the morning of the trial. Word had spread beyond Pinewood Heights. Reporters lined the steps, microphones flashing like hungry eyes. Inside, neighbors filled the gallery, their faces a mix of nerves and anticipation. They had lived the nightmare, and now they wanted to see justice carried out. I sat near the front in a plain suit, Rusty at my feet wearing his vest. His calm presence steadied me. He had been there through every twist, every threat, every long night. Today was no different. That the defendants shuffled in under guard. The so-called masterminds of the fake HOA police no longer strutted with arrogance. Their uniforms had been replaced with orange jumpsuits, their fake badges with shackles. Sylvia was brought in separately, looking pale and hollow after months of awaiting sentencing for her earlier crimes. She avoided eye contact, her once commanding glare now dulled. The illusion of authority had finally broken. The prosecution began with a mountain of evidence, videos from Mike's cameras showing trespassing threats, even the staged eviction attempt, recordings of forged documents, testimony from Janet about harassment and fear, evidence from the moving truck linking them to interstate fraud. Piece by piece the story unfolded. The jury listened intently, heads nodding as the case grew airtight. The defense scrambled, calling the acts misunderstandings or exaggerated enforcement, but every claim crumbled under hard proof. Fraud had no place to hide. Then came my turn. The judge called me forward to testify. I rose, Rusty following calmly. The courtroom hushed. I spoke clearly, recounting the chain of events from the day I arrived at Pinewood Heights to the night of the sting. I described how the imposters tried to enforce fake rules, how they escalated to threats, how neighbors endured intimidation. The jury listened closely. Finally, I revealed the truth. I identified myself not just as a homeowner, but as a federal agent assigned to investigate criminal impersonation and fraud. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Neighbors looked at each other in shock. Mike's jaw dropped so wide the bailiff chuckled. Janet covered her mouth, eyes wide. For months, I had lived among them quietly. Now the truth was laid bare. I explained how the Bureau had built the sting, operation how neighbors' courage contributed to the arrests, how their vigilance helped dismantle a larger network. The judge allowed me to speak at length, recognizing the gravity of the case. When I stepped down, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Pride replaced fear. The neighborhood finally knew the whole story. The defense attempted to object, but their efforts were hollow. The jury had seen too much, heard too much. The tide was irreversible. After days of testimony, the judge delivered instructions, and the jury deliberated. It took less than 3 hours for them to return, guilty on all counts. Fraud, impersonating officers, racketeering, intimidation, conspiracy. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Neighbors hugged one another. Tears flowed freely. Justice had spoken. Sentencing followed quickly. The ringleaders received decades in federal prison. Sylvia, already convicted of her earlier crimes, faced additional time, though her attorney argued mental instability. The judge ordered treatment in addition to punishment. The message was clear. Power built on lies had consequences. Pinewood Heights was free at last. Afterward, neighbors gathered on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as they cheered together. Janet thanked me through tears, saying her son could finally sleep without fear. Mike clapped me on the back, declaring I had ruined his chance at starring in the neighborhood crime documentary. Though his grin betrayed his pride, reporters pressed forward, asking how I kept my cover. I answered only that the real heroes were the families who stood together. Pinewood Heights had chosen unity over fear, and that made all the difference. That evening we returned home. Porch lights glowed warmly along the street. Families stood outside, greeting one another with relief and joy. It felt like the closing of a storm. The air lighter, the ground steadier. Rusty trotted happily from house to house, collecting pats and praise. Children ran freely again. The neighborhood had reclaimed its peace. I sat on my porch reflecting. Months of tension, deception, and danger had tested everyone here, but in the end it forged something stronger. Pinewood Heights was no longer simply a development of houses. It was a community bonded by shared struggle. They had faced fraudsters, imposters, even fire, and emerged united. And I, once only an agent assigned to a case, had found something more. I had found neighbors, friends, and a place that felt like home. As the sun set, I scratched behind Rusty's ears. He leaned against me with quiet trust. I thought about the journey we had taken, the lies exposed, the justice served. Tomorrow new cases would come, new challenges to face. But tonight I allowed myself the rare gift of peace. The neighborhood was safe, the masterminds gone, the truth revealed. Pinewood Heights had written its story in resilience and courage, and I was honored to have been part of it. The case file would close soon, but its lessons would remain. Power built on deception always falls. Communities that stand together cannot be broken. And sometimes the quiet neighbor down the street carries a badge no one can see until the moment it matters most.